Three men had been arguing about her for 6 weeks. They argued the way brothers argue when none of them is entirely wrong and none of them is entirely right. They argued at the dinner table, and out on the fence line, and in the long silences of the ride back from town, when the mountains turned the color of old copper and the wind came down hard from the north, and there was nothing to do but sit with the weight of what had not been decided. The oldest said one thing, the middle one said another. The youngest kept the peace as long as he could, and then he stopped trying, because some arguments are bigger than peacekeeping. The argument was simple on its surface. The letter should have been sent. The woman in Boston who had agreed to marry their brother Edmund should have been told promptly and plainly that Edmund was gone and there was no longer a reason to come. That was the simple version. The complicated version was that Gideon believed Ward should write the letter because Ward handled all correspondence. Ward believed Gideon should write it because Gideon was the eldest, and it was his ranch and his decision. Fletcher believed somebody should write it immediately, and when nobody did, he went quiet in that particular way of his that meant he already knew how things were going to end. The letter was never written. And on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October of 1878, a stagecoach rattled down the valley road into Harrow's Crossing, Montana Territory, with a woman inside who had no idea that three brothers had been failing her for 6 weeks. She was sitting with her back straight because she had learned somewhere in the long stretch of years between losing her parents and arriving in a place she had never seen, that the way you held your body told the world what it was allowed to do to you. Her name was Verity Ashworth. She was 22 years old. She had $11 a carpet bag, a small cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, and a letter she had memorized so thoroughly she could have recited it backward. She had been reading that letter in her mind for 19 days of travel. She knew every word Edmund Calloway had written, every careful sentence, every line that had made her choose him over the other names in the agency's registry. He had not promised her love. He had not described himself in flattering terms or painted pictures of a life more comfortable than the truth. He had written a home-respectful treatment, land under your feet that will not go anywhere. She had liked that. She had liked it because love and Verity Ashworth's experience had a way of going somewhere. Respect and permanence were more reliable. The stagecoach lurched over a rut in the road and she pressed her gloved hand to the window frame to steady herself. Through the glass, Harrow's Crossing resolved slowly from a smear of shapes into something real. A muddy main street, false-fronted buildings with sun-bleached paint, horses tied at the hitching posts outside the general store, their tails switching against the October flies. And all around, pressing in from every direction, like something that had made up its mind, the mountains. She had not expected the mountains to feel so alive. They were not simply large. They were present in the way that certain people are present, taking up more space than their size alone would suggest. The driver, a man named Burl, who had spoken approximately 30 words in 3 days and apparently considered this generous, helped her down from the coach with surprising gentleness. He handed her the carpet bag. He looked at the bay, then at the town, then back at her with an expression she could not quite name. Then he climbed back up onto the box and drove away, and Verity Ashworth stood alone in the mud of the main street with her chin up and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. And she waited to begin her life. No one came. She stood there for the count of 1 full minute, which was long enough to understand that no one was coming, and then she picked up her bag and walked toward the hotel. The Harrow's Crossing Hotel was 3 stories of timber and good intentions, and its desk clerk was a man named Aldous Pitt, who was 62 years old and constitutionally incapable of softening bad news, not because he was unkind, but because he lacked the particular imagination required for the task. He had worked the desk for 20 years and had delivered news of all varieties to all manner of travelers, and he had never once found the right words for any of it, and he had long since stopped looking. He looked at Verity Ashworth when she came through the door. He looked at her carpet bag. He looked at her face. He picked up his pen, and then he put it back down. "You would be the Calloway bride," he said. It was not a question. "Mrs. Edmund Calloway," Verity said. She had been practicing the title since Omaha. It still felt like a garment that did not quite fit, but she wore it with intention. "I need a room and I need to know where I can find my husband." Aldous Pitt set down his pen very carefully, the way a man sets something down when he wants to be doing something with his hands that is not the thing he is about to do with his mouth. "You had better sit down," he said. "I prefer to stand." He looked at her for a moment. He seemed to weigh his options and find them all equally inadequate. Then he told her. Edmund Calloway had been gone for 6 weeks. His heart, the doctor had said. In the incident at the stable, a sudden thing, he had not suffered as far as anyone could tell. The 3 brothers were the ones who had the ranch now. Gideon, Ward, Fletcher. They had been in some disagreement, he understood, about how to handle the situation regarding her. Verity stood very still. She was aware of the clerk watching her, and she was aware of the way the lobby seemed to tilt very slightly, and she was aware that she had $11 and no return ticket and 1,500 miles between herself and the last place she had called home, which had not been much of a home in any case. She was aware of all of this with great clarity, and she held herself steady against it the way she had learned to hold herself steady against the things that could not be changed. The letter, she said, the one telling me not to come. I don't believe a letter was sent, Pitt said. He had the decency to look uncomfortable about this. I see. She kept her voice level. There was a particular skill in that, and she had spent years developing it. Is there a room available? Cash in advance. Of course. She paid him $2 and carried her own bag upstairs. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room he assigned her, and she did not cry because crying was a luxury that required a surplus of time and energy, and she had neither. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she breathed through it the way her father had taught her to breathe through arithmetic problems that seemed unsolvable. You did not look at the whole problem at once. You looked at the next step. Only the next step. The next step was the 3 Calloway brothers who came into Harrow's Crossing on Fridays, according to Aldous Pitt, who had told her this in the same breath as everything else, as if it were simply a fact of the landscape. Today was Friday. Verity Ashworth unpinned her brooch, examined it briefly, pinned it back, and went to find them. She positioned herself on the wooden sidewalk outside the general store, where she had a clear view of the valley road that came down from the north. She bought nothing. She simply stood. Mrs. Abigail Travers, the proprietress, watched her through the window with the frank curiosity of a woman who kept track of everything that happened in her town, which was considerable. Verity was aware of being watched and did not mind. She was used to being assessed. She had been assessed most of her life. She heard them before she saw them. 3 horses coming at a steady walk, raising a thin ribbon of dust against the October sky. Then the riders themselves coming down the valley road abreast, and even at a distance, there was something about them that made you look twice. They were not identical, but they carried a shared quality. The way certain families do something in the bone structure, in the way they sat the saddle, in the amber color of their eyes that you could not have named, but could not have missed. The oldest was in the center. She knew him by his position and by something else, something harder to name. A gravity in the set of his jaw. A weight behind the eyes that the others did not carry in quite the same way. He was perhaps 34, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that weather and work had refined rather than coarsened, and he rode the way men rode who had been in the saddle since before they could properly remember. The one on his left was perhaps 29, with a stillness about him that was not relaxed, a watchfulness held so consistently it had become his natural posture. He was already looking at Verity before his horse had fully stopped, with the particular attention of someone who files information away before he decides what to do with it. The one on the right was younger, perhaps 25, and the difference showed less in his face than in his eyes, which were quicker, more willing to move. He looked at Verity with something that was not quite friendliness, yet but had the shape of it. Verity stepped forward before they had dismounted. I am looking for the Calloway brothers, she said. She was aware of the mud on the toe of her boot and the creases in her traveling dress, and the fact that she looked exactly like what she was, which was a woman who had come a very long way on very little and had just received very bad news. She did not try to look like anything else. My name is Verity Ashworth. I came to marry your brother Edmund. The silence that followed was not long. 4 seconds, perhaps 5. But in those seconds, something passed among the 3 brothers, a kind of language that required no words, the fluency of men who had been reading each other for decades. The eldest swung down from his horse. He moved with the economy of a large man who had learned long ago that he did not need to announce his presence because his presence announced itself. He stood in front of her and he looked at her the way he might have looked at a stretch of new territory, carefully and without flattery. Gideon Calloway, he said. His voice was low, measured the voice of a man who used it only when something needed saying. He gestured without looking away from her. Ward, the middle brother. Fletcher, the youngest. The letter, Verity said, the one informing me not to come. Was not sent, Gideon said. I know you have been unable to agree. Something moved across his face at that. Not defensiveness, something more honest than that. That is correct, he said. I have $11, Verity said. I have no return passage. I have skills that are of use to a working ranch in a household with a 10-year-old boy who by most accounts I have been able to gather in the last 2 hours has been running loose since spring. She looked at each of the three brothers in turn, unhurried. I am not requesting charity. I am proposing employment. Governess and household accountant. $40 a month, room and board. She looked at Gideon again because she had already understood that he was the one who would decide. Children who are grieving do not need managers. They need someone who will sit with them in the difficult parts. I have done it before. I know the territory. Ward's arms were still folded. Fletcher's expression had shifted slightly in the direction of something that was not yet approval, but was adjacent to it. Gideon said, there is a cemetery north of town past the cottonwood stand. If you want to pay your respects before we ride up, we can wait. He turned back to his horse. It was Verity understood the closest she was going to get to yes. She picked up her bag and followed him. The cemetery was small and tidy in the way of places that take their purpose seriously. Edmund Calloway's grave had a marker of rough-cut granite with his name and dates and nothing else. The cottonwoods stood around it with the last of their leaves dry and golden, and the wind moved through them with a sound like something being said in a language she did not speak. Verity stood at the foot of the mound and said goodbye to a man she had never met, who had nonetheless changed the direction of her life entirely. She said it without ceremony and without pretense. She apologized for arriving too late and thanked him for the letters and wished him whatever came after, if anything came after. Then she turned around. Three enormous men stood at a respectful distance. Gideon had his hat in his hands. Ward was looking at the mountains. Fletcher was looking at the grave with an expression that was not the clean face of grief, but something more complicated, a quality of attention that Verity filed away without yet understanding what it meant. And here was the first thing she noticed that did not fit. When a man loses a brother, there is a specific texture to the grief. She had seen it enough to recognize it. Ward's grief was real, she was certain of that. Fletcher's was real. But in Ward's expression alongside the grief, there was a pressure, a kind of held breath, as though he were waiting to see what she had noticed or what she might say. As though Edmund's death were not simply a loss, but a question that had not yet been answered. She did not ask about it. She noted it and she carried it, and she turned toward the horses. I am ready, she said. Calloway Creek Ranch sat in a valley that the mountains had folded their arms around. Deliberately, it seemed as though the land had been set aside for this purpose. Verity saw it first from the back of Gideon's horse perched properly behind the saddle for the hour-long ride north, and the sight of it took something from her that she had not known she was carrying. The tension in her shoulders, the particular vigilance of a woman who has not had a place that was hers in a very long time. The house was 2 stories of dark timber, wide porched facing south to catch the afternoon light. 3 outbuildings spread behind it, a barn, a stable, a long bunkhouse for the ranch hands. The whole of it had the look of a place that had been built to outlast its builders, and this was either reassuring or simply true, and she decided it was both. Agnes Yates was waiting on the porch. She was 61 years old, short and square, with gray hair pinned back from a face that had never been fashionable and was now magnificent through sheer accumulated character. She looked at Verity with eyes the color of well-used flint, and she looked at the 3 brothers with a gaze that said she had known them all since they were small enough to hold and was not particularly impressed by any of them. The room is ready, she said to Verity without preamble or introduction. Pitcher and basin on the washstand. Do not touch anything in the kitchen until I have shown you where things belong. She went back inside. Verity looked at Fletcher, who had the expression of a man suppressing a smile. She has been with the family since our father's time, he said. I gathered. She does not warm quickly. Neither do I, Verity said and went inside. The room was at the end of the upstairs hall, small and plain, with a braided rug on the floor and a window that looked east toward the barn, and beyond it the mountains. A narrow bed with a good wool blanket, a washstand with a mirror above it, small and slightly foxed at the edges. A desk. She set her bag down and stood for a moment in the silence of it, and she thought, this is temporary. Then she thought, I will treat it as permanent, because the only useful thing to do with a place you need to keep is to act as though you intend to. She was washing her face when she heard the voice in the hall. The voice was young, male, and furious. I do not need a governess. Pa said I did not have to have one. He said, and then Gideon's voice lower with something in it that was not quite anger and not quite gentleness, but occupied the space between them. We will see what is needed. You will be civil. She is not even a real missus. She came to marry Uncle Edmund, and Uncle Edmund is dead. A pause, the kind of pause that contains something large and unwieldy. Calder, just the name, but the way Gideon said it changed the texture of the air. Footsteps moved away down the hall. Verity dried her hands on the small towel by the basin. She looked at herself in the foxed mirror. Her face was composed, which was what she needed it to be. She pinned the brooch at her collar, and she went down for supper. Calder Calloway was 10 years old, gray-eyed like his father, with a tangle of dark chestnut hair and a jaw that was already developing the stubborn square geometry it would carry into manhood. He sat at the far end of the supper table and ate without speaking, and pushed his food around the plate and did not once look directly at Verity, which she understood was a strategy. If you did not look at a thing, it could not fully exist in your space. She had used the same strategy herself at 10. It had not worked for her either. Agnes Yates had made elk stew and fresh bread and a dried apple cake that suggested she was marking the occasion in her own way without drawing attention to the marking. The meal was good. The conversation was minimal. Gideon spoke about a section of fence that needed attention before the first real snow. Ward mentioned a supply order that had been delayed out of Billings. Fletcher told a story about one of the ranch hands and a badly behaved mule that made Agnes exhale sharply through her nose, which was apparently her version of laughter. Verity ate and listened and looked and noted. After supper, the kitchen cleared. Gideon went to check the horses, which she already understood was his way of being alone. Ward disappeared into the small office off the main hall. Fletcher helped Agnes with the dishes, which also told her something. And Calder, the moment he thought no one was watching, slid off his chair and moved toward the back door like smoke going under a gap. Calder, Verity said. He froze. His back was to her, his shoulders rose. I am not going to ask you to come back and have a conversation. I only want to ask you one thing, and you can answer or not. He turned slowly. His face was arranged in the most convincing expression of pure indifference a 10-year-old could produce, which is to say it was convincing to no one at all. Where does your father keep the household account ledgers? She asked. He stared at her. Why? Because that is my job. The accounts. He studied her for a long moment with those gray eyes that were going to be his father's eyes when he was grown. Then Miss Agnes has them. In the kitchen cupboard, second shelf left side. Thank you, Verity said. He went out the back door. She stood for a moment in the emptied kitchen, and she thought of beginning. She found the ledgers where he had said. She sat at the kitchen table with a lamp, and the smaller of her two notebooks, the one that had been her father's and still had his handwriting in the first several pages, and she began to read. It took her less than 40 minutes to find the first discrepancy. The feed supplier had been billing for quantities that did not match the delivery records Agnes kept in her own system, which Agnes had maintained separately and consistently for 20 years, out of an abundance of practical caution. The numbers were off by small amounts, not large ones. $3 here, $5 there. The kind of difference that looked like rounding error until you lined it up over months and saw the shape of it. It was not rounding error. She wrote down what she found in her own notation, organized it by month, and drew a line under the total. It was not a fortune, but it was not nothing either, and more than the money, what it told her was that the accounts had not been watched since the woman who knew how to watch them was gone. Rowena Calloway, Gideon's wife, dead 14 months. She did not know this yet by name, but she knew it by the gap in the records, the place where a careful hand had kept things straight and then simply stopped. She closed the ledger and sat for a while with her father's notebook open in front of her. From outside, she heard the sound of someone in the barn moving with the unhurried regularity of a large man doing familiar work in the dark. She had already learned to recognize Gideon Calloway by the sounds of his movements, the particular weight and pace of him. She blew out the lamp and went upstairs. She had been at the ranch for 5 days when she found the boy in the barn. She had not gone looking for him. She had gone to find a bridle that Agnes needed relocated, and she pushed open the barn door into the smell of hay and horses and coal wood, and there was Calder sitting in the straw against the flank of an old gray mare, with his knees drawn up and his face buried in his arms and his shoulders doing the particular small movement that meant he was crying and did not want to be doing it where anyone could see. Verity did not announce herself. She found a hay bale at a reasonable distance, and she sat on it and she waited. The mare regarded her with enormous liquid patience. After a while, the small movement in Calder's shoulders stopped. He lifted his head. He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes and the fierce dignity of a child who has been caught in something private. "I was not crying," he said. "All right," Verity said. He looked at the mare. "Her name is Duchess. Mama named her. She said a horse that plain needed a beautiful name. Your mother sounds like she understood something important." He was quiet. The barn settled around them. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted its weight in the paddock. "She was the best person," Calder said very quietly. "Better than anyone. Better than Pa, even." He stopped himself. "Putty is good. He is just. He does not have words for things anymore. Since Mama." Verity looked at Duchess, who accepted this observation with the equanimity appropriate to an old horse who has heard a great deal. "That happens," Verity said. "When the grief is big enough, the words stop working. They usually come back. How long does it take? Different for everyone." He was quiet for a moment. Then Pa tried to go get the doctor. Through the pass in the snow, he rode all night. He said it with the flat recitation of something told and retold, a story that had become part of the furniture of his memory. He got there, but it was too late already. He looked at his hands. He blames himself. He does not say that, but I can tell. Verity said nothing. She simply sat with him and the information, and that was the right thing, and something in Calder seemed to recognize it because his shoulders came down slightly from where they had been. "I burned my schoolbook," he said, and this too had the quality of a confession. "Which ones? The arithmetic, the grammar. I kept the one about the mountain men. That is probably the best one." He looked at her sideways. "You have not even read it." "No, but I would like to. Would you lend it to me?" He considered this seriously. "Maybe. I will treat it carefully." "I know you will," he said, and the certainty in it caught her off guard because it meant he had already made some assessment of her that he had not announced. He stood up, brushing hay from his trousers. He looked at her one more time with his father's gray eyes. "Mama used to say that when you do not know what to do next, you do the next smallest thing you can do." "That is very good advice." "Yeah," he said, and then almost to himself as he moved toward the barn door, "I thought you would say that." That night, Verity heard the argument. It came up through the floorboards of her room in the particular muffled way that voices travel through a house at night when the wind has died and everything else has gone quiet. She was not trying to listen. She was sitting at the small desk with her notebook, working through the second month of feed supplier invoices, and the voices came up regardless. Ward's voice: "She cannot remain here indefinitely. We know nothing about her beyond what she has told us herself." Fletcher's voice: "Did you watch Calder at supper tonight? That boy sat at the table without trying to leave before the blessing was finished. In 8 months, Ward." A pause. Gideon's voice, lower than the others, slower with more weight behind it: "She stays until we have a good reason to ask her to go." Ward again: "And if we find no good reason?" The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. Verity set down her pen. She looked at the notebook, at her father's careful handwriting on the first pages. She picked up the pen again and wrote at the bottom of her current page, "Stay until there is a good reason to go. Ensure there is no good reason." She went back to the invoices. On the 6th morning, there was a cup of coffee on the kitchen table when she came downstairs. This was not unusual in itself. Agnes Yates made coffee before dawn as a matter of course, and there was always a pot on the stove. What was unusual was the cup already poured and set at the place where Verity habitually sat, and in the cup a small amount of cream stirred in the precise amount that Verity took, which she had told no one. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment looking at the cup. Then she heard the barn door far off and the sound of Gideon Calloway beginning his morning. She sat down and picked up the cup and held it with both hands and thought about the specific quality of attention required to notice something as small as how much cream a person put in their coffee and to act on that noticing silently without expectation of acknowledgement. She thought about that for a while. Then she drank the coffee and went to find Agnes and ask where Calder's lesson books were kept. On the 8th day, Ward Calloway left something on the corner of the kitchen table. It was an invoice from the hardware supplier in Billings, and it had no note attached and no explanation offered. He had simply set it there and gone about his business. Verity picked it up. She compared it against the delivery record she found in the supply ledger that Agnes kept in the cupboard. She found two discrepancies in one item billed twice under slightly different descriptions. She wrote up her findings on a half sheet of paper organized clearly with the relevant ledger page references noted beside each point. She left the invoice and the half sheet on the corner of the table and went to give Calder his morning lesson. That afternoon, both the invoice and the half sheet were gone. In their place was a second invoice from the saddle supplier. She sat down, looked at the saddle invoice, and almost smiled. Calder's morning lessons had taken on a shape by the end of the first week, one that bore little resemblance to what conventional schooling would have prescribed, but had the advantage of actually working. She had discovered through patient observation that he was not resistant to learning. He was resistant to arbitrariness, which was a different thing entirely and required a different response. She did not assign him reading from the grammar primer. She assigned him passages from the Mountain Men book he had kept, and she asked him to read them aloud, and when he stumbled, she corrected without comment and moved on. She did not present arithmetic as arithmetic. She presented it as ranch mathematics, and she used the supply ledgers as her textbook because the numbers in those pages were numbers he could see the meaning of. "What would the feed supplier owe us?" she asked on the third morning. "If he has been overcharging us $3 per delivery and making 3 deliveries a month for 8 months. Calder worked it out on his slate. He got it wrong the first time and right the second time. He looked at the answer. "That is $72, he said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a lot." "It is enough to matter," Verity said, "which is why the numbers need watching." He looked at his slate again with an expression that was new. Not enthusiasm exactly, but recognition of something useful. She had been at Calloway Creek Ranch for 12 days when Fletcher sat down across from her on the afternoon porch with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who has decided to do something he has been considering for a while. "You want to know about Rowena?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I want to understand the household I am working in," Verity said carefully. Fletcher wrapped both hands around his cup. He was quiet for a moment, arranging something. Then he talked. Rowena Calloway had been from a settlement 2 valleys east. She had been 20 when she married Gideon and had spent the years since learning everything the ranch required and inventing the rest. She had kept the accounts with the precision of someone who took seriously the idea that numbers told the truth about how a thing was actually going, as opposed to how it seemed to be going. She had taught Calder his first letters and his first sums, and she had, by all accounts, known how to sit in a room with a difficult thing without flinching. She had taken sick in the late winter of 1877, a fever first, then worse than a fever. The pass that connected their valley to the town with the nearest doctor was iced over and had been for 6 weeks. Gideon had ridden through it anyway at night alone in the kind of cold that had killed better equipped men than him. He had gotten through. He had returned with the doctor. By then, Rowena was 14 hours gone. "He has not forgiven himself," Fletcher said. "Your brother told me," Verity said. "Calder." Fletcher looked at her. "What did he say?" That Gideon blames himself for being too late, that he does not say it, but anyone paying attention can tell. She looked at her coffee, and that he has not had words for things since she died. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "That is more than Calder has said about it to anyone in the family. Children often speak more easily to strangers about the things that matter most. There is less at stake." Fletcher nodded. He turned his cup in his hands. "I am telling you this because Gideon will not. And I think you should know. He is not cold. He is not indifferent. He is carrying something very heavy in a very particular way, and the weight of it looks like distance if you do not know what you are seeing." Verity thought about the coffee cup already poured and waiting the morning she had come downstairs. "I know what I am seeing," she said. Fletcher looked at her for a moment with those quick, assessing eyes. Then he nodded once satisfied and picked up his coffee. The thing about Ward Calloway she came to understand was that he expressed trust through the medium of paperwork. Every morning there was something new on the corner of the kitchen table. An invoice, a contract renewal, a statement from the cattle broker that did not quite balance. He left these things without comment and retrieved her analysis without comment, and the arrangement suited them both entirely because what it communicated was not silence, but a very specific and efficient kind of speech. On the 14th day, she found a supply statement from a man named Roscoe Tulliver, who was listed in the ledgers as the primary cattle broker for the region. She compared it against the recorded transactions from the previous season. There was a difference of $11 in the final settlement that she could not account for through ordinary calculation. It might have been a clerical error. It might have been something else. She noted it and wrote it down and left a notation beside the statement, and she did not say anything about it because she was not yet certain, but she noted it. On the 16th day, she mentioned Tulliver's name to Fletcher casually in the context of asking about the general structure of cattle commerce in the valley. Fletcher said, "Tulliver runs the brokering for most of the ranches between here and the Highwood Range, has for years. Edmund had some disagreement with him before he passed about the autumn price on a lot of steers. Nothing unusual. Buyers and sellers argue." He said it easily, but his eyes moved just slightly in the direction of somewhere else and then came back. Verity said, "Of course, thank you." She filed it. She did not know yet what it was part of. On the 17th morning, Conrad Whitmore came to Calloway Creek Ranch. Verity was at the kitchen table with the supply ledgers when she heard horses in the yard and looked out the window and saw a man she did not recognize, dismounting with the ease of someone who is accustomed to arriving places and being received. He was perhaps 50, broad-chested, well-dressed in the manner of a man who has money and wears it without ostentation, which is a more sophisticated kind of ostentation. He had a bottle of good whiskey in one hand and the expression of a neighbor paying a friendly call. She watched from the window as Gideon came out of the barn and the two men shook hands. Whitmore's face arranged itself into the right configuration for sympathy regarding Edmund. She could not hear the words, but she could read the shape of the conversation. She went to the porch with the excuse of shaking out a rug, which needed doing anyway. From the porch, she could hear clearly enough. Whitmore was saying that the valley had lost a fine man in Edmund Calloway. He was saying that he hoped the brothers were managing the transition. He was saying that the Calloway land was some of the finest in the territory, which everyone knew, and that if the family ever found itself in need of simplifying its holdings, he would always be a willing and fair buyer as a neighbor and a friend, and there was absolutely no pressure of any kind intended in that. Gideon said thank you. 2 words. Flat, complete, final. Whitmore smiled and rode away. Verity stood with the rug draped over her arm and watched him go. He had not looked at the house when he arrived. He had not looked at the barn or the outbuildings. He had looked at the road. Specifically, he had looked at the track that ran north from the ranch gate toward the upper valley, the road that a man with freight to move would consider if he were thinking about access routes. She went back inside and picked up her pen. She wrote at the bottom of the current page, Whitmore. Purpose, the Northern Road. Why, it was on the 20th morning that Ward Calloway chose a different kind of conversation. He came into the kitchen at breakfast when the full household was present, Gideon at the head of the table, and Fletcher midway through a second helping, and Agnes at the stove, and Calder bent over his arithmetic, and Verity with the household ledger open beside her plate, and Ward sat down and looked at her directly. "You reviewed the hardware invoice last week," he said. "I did." "And the saddle supplier?" "Yes." "And you are currently looking at the main household ledger?" "I am." His voice was even, not hostile, but with the quality of a man who intends to understand exactly what he has let into his house. "By what authority?" Verity set down her fork. She had been waiting for this, not with dread, but with the practical awareness that it was coming and would need to be met properly. "The authority of the job you hired me to do," she said. "Household accounts are part of household management. A household that does not know what it is spending is a household making decisions without all the available information." She reached across the table and opened the ledger to the page she had marked. The feed supplier has been overcharging you by between $2 and $5 per delivery for the past 8 months. I can show you the exact figures. She turned the ledger so he could read it. I can also show you the saddle supplier billing, which has a more interesting problem, and the Tulliver settlement statement from October of last year, which I have not yet resolved to my own satisfaction. Ward looked at the page. He read it. He was the kind of reader who did not skim, who moved through numbers the way a careful man moves through unfamiliar terrain. Then he looked up at her. "You found this," he said. "In 14 days, Verity said. "I would have found it sooner, but I was being careful about what I touched." Ward looked at the figures again. Then he set the ledger back on the table with a precision that was its own form of statement. Calder, who had been watching all of this from behind his arithmetic slate, said, "I thought something was wrong with that number too. I just did not know how to say it right." Gideon looked at his son. He looked at Verity. He picked up his coffee cup. "The feed supplier," he said. "When can you have the full accounting, Mom?" "By Thursday," Verity said. He nodded once and went back to his breakfast. Ward had not said anything further, but when she looked at him across the table, something in his face had changed. Not warmly, not dramatically. The watchfulness was still there. But the angle of it was different. He was no longer watching her the way a man watches a stranger. He was watching her the way a man watches someone he has begun provisionally to factor into his calculations. That evening after supper was cleared, and Gideon had gone to the barn, and Fletcher was out on the porch with his coffee, and Agnes was in her room, Calder appeared at the door of the kitchen with something under his arm. He set it on the table in front of Verity, the Mountain Men book, well worn with a bent corner on the cover where it had been dropped at some point and never quite straightened out. He set it down without ceremony and stood back. "You said you wanted to read the part I liked best," he said. "Page 43. That is the one about John Coulter running from the Blackfoot. Mama used to read it to me on Sundays." Verity looked at the book. She looked at the boy. "Thank you, Calder." He turned toward the stairs. Then he stopped without turning back. "I'm glad you did not go," he said to the staircase. "When Mr. Pitt told you about Uncle Edmund, I am glad you did not just get back on the coach." He went upstairs. Verity sat alone at the kitchen with her father's notebook and Calder's book and the evening sounds of a working ranch settling into night, and she held very still with all of it for a long moment, and she thought of beginning. Then she opened the ledger and went back to the feed supplier. 3 weeks passed the way weeks pass in a working ranch in the high country, when the season is turning, which is to say they pass quickly in the body and slowly in everything else. The body had its calendar of tasks, and the tasks did not wait. The fence line on the north section needed attention before the ground froze too hard to sink a post. The cattle needed moving from the upper summer range to the lower winter pasture before the first serious snow came down off the peaks and made the trail treacherous. The supply order from Billings had arrived short on 2 items and overstocked on a third, and Ward spent the better part of a Tuesday writing a letter to the supply house that was impeccably polite and made perfectly clear that the error would not be overlooked a second time. Verity watched all of this. She had made a habit of watching before acting in every situation she had encountered in her life, because watching told you things that asking could not, and she had found the habit reliable. What she watched at Callaway Creek Ranch in those 3 October weeks was a household that was functioning the way a body functions when something has been removed from it. All the essential operations continuing in the blood still moving, the work still getting done. But in the place where the missing thing had been a particular kind of compensatory effort that everyone was performing without discussing. Gideon doing more than any one man should reasonably carry. Ward filling in the gaps of the accounting work with a thoroughness that was impressive and also unsustainable. Fletcher Ed serving as the connective tissue between the ranch and the world beyond it. Riding into Harrow's Crossing more often than strictly necessary because the information he brought back was the thing that kept everyone oriented. And Calder at the center of all of it, orbiting without quite belonging to any of its rhythms. A boy who had lost the person who had made the household make sense to him and had not yet found another organizing principle. The Mountain Men book had been returned to her after 2 days, which she understood was Calder's version of trust. She read it on the evenings when the lamp was burning low and the ranch had gone quiet, and the next morning she told him which part she had found most extraordinary and he told her which parts she had gotten wrong in her assessment, and this became their method. Argument as connection. She suspected this was how he had talked with his mother, and she was careful not to say so. On the subject of arithmetic, they had reached a kind of armed truce. He would do the problems she assigned if they were problems that meant something in the material world of the ranch. He would not do problems that existed for no other reason than to demonstrate that he could do them. She considered this a reasonable position and adapted accordingly. The ledger on the kitchen table corner grew and shrank as Ward left things and she returned them, and this too had become a language. She had resolved the feed supplier discrepancy and written it up in full and given it to Ward without ceremony on a Wednesday morning. He had looked at it for 3 minutes, said nothing, and the following week the feed supplier's invoices arrived with figures that matched the delivery records exactly for the first time in 8 months. Nobody mentioned this either. It was simply corrected the way you correct the course of something that has drifted without making an occasion of the correction. What had not been corrected and what she was not yet ready to raise with anyone was the entry she kept returning to in the October ledger of the previous year. Roscoe Tulliver, the cattle broker. The settlement figure from the autumn sale of the previous year was off by $11 when she ran the calculation correctly against the weights and grades recorded in the ranch's own records. This was not the feed supplier kind of discrepancy, which had been consistent and systematic and therefore clearly intentional. This was a single number in a single settlement, and it might have been a genuine error. Tulliver's operation handled dozens of ranches across the Valley region. A mistake in one ranch's settlement was not impossible. But she had also found buried in a paragraph of Fletcher's description of the October before Edmund died, a reference to an argument. Edmund and Tulliver disputing the price on a lot of steers. Nothing unusual, Fletcher had said. Buyers and sellers argued. And he had said it easily, but his eyes had gone somewhere else for a moment and come back, and she had noted that movement the way she noted everything, which was carefully without drawing conclusions before she had enough to conclude from. She wrote at the bottom of a fresh page Tulliver's settlement, $11. Edmund's dispute. Related, she did not know yet. She left it there and moved on, and came back to it the way you come back to a number that does not add up, patient and persistent, because the numbers always told you eventually. November came in cold and clear. The first week of it brought a frost that turned the valley meadow white each morning and burned off by 10 o'clock under a sun that was still warm but no longer warm enough. And in the middle of the second week on a Tuesday morning, when the sky was the kind of pale blue that seemed to contain the entire weight of the coming winter, Fletcher rode back from Harrow's Ordnance Crossing in the middle of the day, which was not his habit. Verity was at the kitchen table with Calder and his arithmetic when she heard the horse come into the yard faster than Fletcher usually brought it. She looked up. Through the window, she saw him dismount and leave the horse standing without properly hitching it, which told her something before she had heard a word. She closed the arithmetic workbook and told Calder to copy out the next page of his reading assignment. Then she went to the door. Gideon was already in the yard. He had come from the barn at the sound of the horse. Ward had appeared from the direction of the office. The three brothers stood together and Fletcher talked, and Verity watched from the doorway, and she saw the information arrive in Gideon's body the way bad news arrives in a person who is already carrying too much weight. Not a collapse, a tightening, the opposite of collapse. She went to the door and she listened. Roscoe Tulliver had been found dead in his office that morning. The back of his head, no sign of forced entry. The door had been unlocked from the outside, which meant either the lock had not been engaged, or the person who came through it had a key, or the person who came through it had been welcomed in. The county deputy had been through the office and was awaiting the arrival of Sheriff Orrin Bassett from the north end of the hatchery, who was currently the acting authority for this quarter of the territory. Ward said immediately, Edmund had a dispute with Tulliver. Fletcher said, that was months ago. Ward said, and Gideon was at Tulliver's office yesterday to settle the account from the September lot. The silence after that was the kind that contained too many things to be comfortable. Gideon said, I was there in the afternoon. The settlement was routine. There was no disagreement. I left before 4 o'clock. He said it simply and without particular emphasis, the way a man states a fact he considers self-evident. And Verity, standing in the doorway, believed him without reservation. Not because she was inclined to believe him, but because in 3 weeks of watching Gideon Calloway, With the close and systematic attention she applied to everything that mattered, she had identified precisely the range of things he was capable of, and deliberate violence against a man he had settled accounts with peacefully was not inside that range. She went back to the kitchen and Calder and the arithmetic workbook. She was very careful to keep her face completely ordinary. The following 2 days were quiet in a way that had more tension in it than noise would have had. The sheriff's office sent a deputy out to take statements on the Wednesday. Gideon answered the questions in his kitchen at the table where he ate his meals, with Agnes Yates standing by the stove, and Fletcher at the far chair, and Ward by the window, and he told the deputy exactly what he had told his brothers. He had gone to settle the September account. He had been there perhaps 40 minutes. He had left before 4. The settlement was in the ranch records. The deputy wrote it down and left. On Thursday morning, Verity found something in the kitchen that had not been there the night before. Ward had left on the corner of the table not an invoice but a folded document. She opened it carefully. It was a record of the payments made to Roscoe Tulliver over the past 3 years, organized by date and amount apparently pulled from the back records that Ward maintained in his office. She read it through twice slowly, and she understood that Ward had placed it there not because he needed her analysis of the numbers, but because he needed someone outside the family to look at it with fresh eyes and tell him if it contained anything he should be worried about. She read it a third time. The numbers were regular and consistent, nothing unusual in the amounts, nothing unusual in the frequency. But in the October payment from the previous year, the notation Ward had made beside the figure was different from all the others. Every other monthly notation said simply, settlement, lot number, head count, price per head. The October notation said disputed rate final agreed, $11. She sat very still. Edmund had disputed the rate in October. The settlement had been adjusted. The final agreed figure was the one that appeared in the ledger, but it was $11 less than the calculation Verity had done based on the weights and grades in the ranch records, which meant either Edmund had agreed to a figure that was still short because he had accepted a compromise rather than fight further, or the adjustment had been made in the notation without being made in the actual payment. She did not know which, but she knew the $11 now had a history, and the history had a shape, and the shape was beginning to look like something. She wrote at the bottom of her page Tulliver adjusted Edmund's settlement. Dispute resolved with a lower figure, $11 below correct calculation. Whose adjustment? She replaced the document on the corner of the table and went to find Calder for his morning lesson. On Friday, the 14th of November, Sheriff Orrin Bassett came to Callaway Creek Ranch. He did not come alone. He brought 2 deputies, which was already a statement. And he brought a man Verity did not recognize, a man perhaps 38 years old with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to someone who spent his professional life waiting for the right moment to move. He was introduced as Chet Rafferty, recently employed in the area, who had a statement to give regarding the movements of individuals in and around Harrow's Crossing on the evening of the 11th of November. They were standing in the yard, all of them, Gideon and Ward and Fletcher and Agnes on the porch steps, and Verity at the corner of the house near the kitchen door, and Calder, who had appeared from nowhere the way children appear when something important is happening. Rafferty's statement was this: he had been on the main street of Harrow's Crossing on the evening of the 11th past 6 o'clock, and he had seen Gideon Callaway leaving the building that housed Roscoe Tulliver's brokerage office. The time was after 6 because the lamplighter had already made his first pass of the evening, and Rafferty had noted the light because he had been waiting for it to orient himself in an unfamiliar town. Bassett then produced a receipt. It was folded and somewhat worn as though it had been handled, and when he opened it, Verity could see from where she stood that it bore a signature at the bottom in what was presented as Gideon's hand. The receipt was dated the 11th of November. It noted that Gideon Callaway had attended the office of Roscoe Tulliver for the purpose of settling a financial dispute. Gideon's voice was very controlled. He had not been at Tulliver's office on the evening of the 11th. He had been there the previous afternoon on the 10th for a routine settlement payment. He had a record of that payment in the ranch ledger. Ward could produce it within 5 minutes. Bassett said the ledger record would be examined. But the witness testimony and the signed receipt placed Gideon at the scene on the evening in question, and until the matter could be properly examined before the territorial court, he was required to come in. The deputies moved forward. Calder said, "Pa," just the one word, but it landed in the yard like a stone. Gideon turned and looked at his son with an expression that Verity had not seen on his face before, and she had been watching his face carefully for 3 weeks. It was not fear. It was the expression of a man who has spent years protecting something and is now being asked to entrust the protection of it to other people, which is a different and harder kind of courage. Calder was moving before Ward could stop him, stepping forward toward the nearest deputy with his small fists at his sides, and Fletcher got to him first, a hand on each of the boy's shoulders from behind, holding him without restraining him. Just the contact of it, and Calder went still in his grip. Ward spoke to Bassett in a voice that was completely level and said the things that needed saying about the consequences of a wrongful detainment and the legal obligations of the territorial court system and the specific records they would be producing, and Bassett listened with the expression of a man who has made his decision and is not interested in the conversation around it. The deputies put the restraints on Gideon in his own yard. He did not resist. He walked with the deputies to their horses and mounted when directed. And before he turned onto the valley road, he looked back once. Not at the house, not at Ward or Fletcher. He looked past all of them, directly at Verity, and held the look for 3 full seconds. There was nothing in that look that was pleading or desperate or even hopeful. It was simply a look of placement, of deliberate and intentional placement, the way you set a thing you need to keep safe into the hands of someone you have decided to trust. Verity held the look. She nodded once. He turned his horse and rode away down the valley road. Agnes Yates went inside without a word. The sound of her in the kitchen afterward, the deliberate, methodical sounds of a woman who was working because working was the only acceptable response to catastrophe, carried through the whole house for the rest of the afternoon. Fletcher kept his hands on Calder's shoulders until the horses had disappeared around the bend in the road. Then he crouched down to the boy's level and said something quiet that Verity could not hear. Calder nodded stiffly twice and went inside. Ward stood in the yard and looked at the road for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, "The receipt is a forgery." He said it as a statement of fact, not a question, not a theory. The same flat certainty he applied to numbers that did not add up. "I need to see the original document," Verity said. Ward looked at her. "The original is with Bassett. A certified copy, or even an examined copy provided someone present, can attest to its accuracy. Fletcher has connections in town." Fletcher was already reaching for his hat. That night, Calder knocked on Verity's door at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had not been asleep. She had been sitting at the small desk with the lamp and her father's notebook and the supply ledger and the record of Tulliver payments that Ward had given her. And she had been working because working was her version of what Agnes was doing in the kitchen. She had covered 4 pages of her notebook with observations and calculations in questions organized in columns because the columns helped her see the structure of a thing when the surface of it was still unclear. She opened the door and Calder was standing in the hallway in his nightshirt with his hair loose and his eyes dry, which was worse in a particular way than if he had been crying. The crying had already happened somewhere private, and what was left was the cold clarity on the other side of it. He came in. He sat on the edge of the chair by the window, the small one, not the desk chair. He looked at the papers spread across the desk, but did not ask about them. "Pa did not kill Mr. Tulliver," he said. "Pa would not do that." "I know," Verity said. "How do you know?" She sat on the edge of the bed so she was at his level. "Because I have been watching your father for 3 weeks. Not the way people watch someone they are being polite to. The way I watch the ledgers, looking for the structure underneath." She kept her voice even. "There are things your father is capable of and things he is not. What they are accusing him of is not inside what he is capable of." Calder thought about this. You can tell that from watching, usually. In the receipt, there is something wrong with it. I am going to find out what. He was quiet for a moment. The wind had come up outside and was pushing against the window glass with a sound like something trying to get in. "Mama used to say when you do not know what to do next, you do the next smallest thing you can do," he said. "You told me that before." "I know." He looked at his hands. "I needed to hear it again." Verity let the silence sit for a moment because sometimes silence was the next smallest thing. "I will not leave," she said before he could ask. "I want you to know that without having to ask it." He looked at her, the gray eyes that were going to be his father's eyes in a face that had not yet grown into them. "I know," he said. And then very quietly, "That is why I came here instead of Ward's room." He went back to bed. Verity sat with the lamp and the notebook and the ledgers for the rest of the night, and she worked because the next smallest thing was always somewhere in the numbers. Conrad Whitmore arrived at Callaway Creek Ranch on the morning of the 15th of November, less than 24 hours after Gideon was taken. He arrived with the expression of a man who has heard difficult news and come immediately as a neighbor and a friend should. He expressed his sympathy regarding the situation. He called it an unfortunate misunderstanding. He said he had every confidence the matter would be resolved. He said that Gideon Callaway was a man of unimpeachable character, and anyone who knew him knew that. Then he said very naturally, in the same easy tone in which he had said everything else, that in the meantime, if the family found itself in need of some financial flexibility, given the potential legal expenses ahead, he would be pleased to make a fair and generous offer on any portion of the ranch property they might wish to liquidate. Ward said no. 2 syllables, flat, complete. Whitmore received this with a gracious nod and rode away. Verity stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go. He had come within 20 hours. He had known before the morning was old. That meant he had a source of information inside the sheriff's office, or he was the reason the sheriff's office had moved in the first place, or both. And he had come not to help, but to acquire. He had arrived with the vocabulary of sympathy and the arithmetic of a buyer calculating what distress was going to make available to him. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table with her notebook. She wrote, "Whitmore arrived within 20 hours. He knew before the town did, or simultaneously. He came to buy, not to help. He has been watching this ranch for a reason. The northern road, the pasture access. What does he need that this land provides?" She had asked Fletcher 2 weeks earlier about the geography of the valley and the routes connecting the ranches to the trading centers north and east. Fletcher had explained it the way he explained everything readily and in detail. There were 2 viable routes for large-scale freight from the northern settlement cluster to the railhead at Billings. One of them ran east through the Highwood Pass, which was prone to ice for 4 months of the year. The other came south through the Callaway Valley and picked up the main road at the junction 3 miles beyond the ranch's north boundary. Any operation running freight on any significant scale through this valley needed either the cooperation of the Callaway Ranch or the ownership of it. Verity looked at what she had written. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top what Whitmore needs. Below that, what Tulliver had. Below that, what Edmund knew. She sat with those 3 lines for a long time. On the 3rd day after Gideon's arrest, Fletcher came back from Harrow's Crossing with an examined copy of the disputed receipt. He had obtained it through the county clerk's office, which processed copies of all documents submitted as evidence in a preliminary matter, and he had paid the clerk's fee and waited while the copy was made and attested and signed. He put it on the kitchen table in front of Verity. She read it once quickly and then again slowly, and then she picked up the stack of ranch contracts from the file that Ward had placed on the table beside it, the contracts that bore Gideon's actual signature across a range of transactions from the past 4 years, and she began to compare. She worked for 2 hours. She did not speak during those 2 hours. Agnes brought her coffee twice and did not ask what she was finding. Ward came to the kitchen, once looked at the papers spread across the table, and left without saying anything. Fletcher sat in the corner chair and waited, because Fletcher understood the particular kind of work that required silence around it, the way certain animals required silence to function. At the end of the 2 hours, Verity put down her pen. "2 things, she said. Fletcher leaned forward. "First, Gideon signs his name with a particular linking stroke at the end of the final letter of Callaway. It appears in every authentic signature in this file across 4 years and dozens of different contexts. It is not a taught stroke. It is a personal habit, the kind that develops through years of signing the same name. It is not present in the signature on this receipt." She turned the receipt so Fletcher could see the comparison. "Second, the date notation on this receipt is written in the format used in Eastern cities and Eastern commercial correspondence. Day, then month, then year. Gideon was born in this territory. Every date in his own hand in these records follows the Western Convention month first." She pointed to the date on the receipt, then to the dates in the ranch records. The person who wrote this receipt was either not from this region or was unaware of this specific habit. Either way, they did not write it by watching Gideon Callaway write anything. Fletcher looked at the two documents for a long time. "The receipt is forged," he said. "Yes. Someone created it to place Gideon at the scene on the evening of the 11th. And someone told Rafferty exactly what to say about the lamplight and the timing. That story was prepared. It was too specific to be invented on the spot." Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "Rafferty is new to the area. He has been here perhaps 3 weeks, which means he arrived specifically for this purpose." Fletcher stood up and went to the window and looked out at the yard where the frost was still white on the fence rails at this hour. "Whitmore," he said. "I cannot prove that yet," Verity said, "but I need to look at Tulliver's records, not the records that were submitted to the county office, the actual records from his brokerage operation." She looked at Fletcher. "Is there any access to his office?" "His wife is still in town. She is trying to arrange the sale of the business. She does not understand the books." He turned from the window. "I could speak to her. Tell her I can review the records to ensure no outstanding debts are owed to the estate. That is true, and it is also useful to her." Fletcher reached for his coat. The widow Tulliver was a woman named Lavinia, who was 51 years old and had never involved herself in her husband's commercial affairs, not from disinterest, but from a clear-eyed understanding of where her skills ended and his began. And she had spent her marriage building the domestic side of their household with the same rigor he applied to the brokerage side. She was practical and exhausted and frightened in the specific way of a woman who has lost the person who understood the money, and she agreed to Verity's request within the space of a conversation that Fletcher managed with great care and genuine delicacy. The following afternoon, Verity sat in the back room of Roscoe Tulliver's brokerage office with the ledgers that Lavinia had unlocked for her. She worked alone. She had brought her own notebook and her own pen because she did not know what she would find or what she would need to record, and she preferred her own materials. The surface ledger was orderly. Tulliver had been a careful bookkeeper, which was consistent with a man whose business required exact accounting over many transactions. She read through 2 years of records with the patience that her father had taught her, the patience of someone who is not looking for a specific thing, but is looking for the place where the pattern changes. She found it in the first year. There was a second column of entries that appeared in a supplementary notebook tucked behind the primary ledger inside the back cover of the cabinet drawer. This was not where supplementary records were normally kept. This was where a man put something he did not want found on a casual inspection. Verity recognized the difference between filing and concealment because her father had shown her that difference as part of the same lesson in which he showed her double-entry bookkeeping. The supplementary notebook was not double-entry in any conventional sense. It was a private record written in Tulliver's hand, and it contained payments received from an entity recorded only by the initials CW. These payments had been made monthly for 2 years and 4 months. They were substantial. The notation beside each payment read in different phrasings, but with consistent meaning: rate adjustment, or price facilitation, or market coordination. Verity read those phrases 3 times. Rate adjustment, price facilitation, market coordination. These were the vocabulary of a man who was being paid to control the price at which cattle moved through his brokerage, to the disadvantage of the ranch's selling and the advantage of whoever was paying him to keep the rates suppressed. The ranches in this region sold through Tulliver because he was the established broker. They trusted the rates he reported because they had no independent way to verify the market price from this distance. And someone with the initials CW had been paying him for more than 2 years to ensure those rates were consistently lower than they should have been. She turned to the last 6 weeks of entries. The payments continued, but beside the final 3 in the margin, Tulliver had written notations that were different from everything else in the book. The first said reconsidering, the second 2 weeks later said cannot continue. The third, written approximately 10 days before his death, said must speak with Geese Gideon Calloway. Tulliver had been preparing to tell Gideon what had been done. He had been carrying the knowledge of it for 2 years and 4 months, and he had finally reached the point at which he could not continue, and he had decided to go to the man whose ranch had been most directly affected by the suppressed pricing. And before he could do that, someone had come through his unlocked office door and ensured that he never would. Verity sat in the back room of Roscoe Tulliver's office for a moment without writing anything. Then she turned to a fresh page and began. She worked for an hour and a half, transferring everything she needed into her own notation file organized by date and amount and the marginal notes in their original language. She recorded the initials CW in the range of payments in the timeline with mathematical precision. She recorded the final 3 entries in their marginal notes. She recorded the total suppressed from the ranches of the region over the documented period, which was a number large enough to make the bottom of her stomach go cold when she saw it written out in full. She thanked Lavinia Tulliver at the door with the honesty of telling her that there appeared to be no outstanding debts owed to the estate, which was true in the narrow sense. And she walked back through Harrow's Crossing in the late afternoon light with her notebook under her arm and her mind moving through the structure of what she had found, the way water moves through a system, filling each channel and following the line of least resistance toward the lowest point. The lowest point was Conrad Whitmore. She did not yet have his name in the notebook beside the initials, but she had enough to draw the map. On the afternoon of the 19th of November, Calder Calloway went to the grain storage building at the back of the barn complex because he needed something to occupy his hands and his mind, and the barn itself had already been organized and reorganized twice in the past 5 days, and there was nothing more to do in it. The grain storage building was used primarily in the late autumn and winter months and had the particular smell of those seasons, dry grain and cold wood and the ghost of summer. He moved through it methodically without a specific purpose, which was unusual for him because he was not a boy who did things without a specific purpose. But the past 5 days had been unusual for everyone at Callaway Creek Ranch, and the usual rules were suspended. He found the watch near the south corner, half buried in the loose grain that had spilled from a sack sometime earlier in the season. He almost missed it, but he was methodical even in purposelessness, and he swept the floor of the corner with the side of his boot before moving on, and the metal caught what little light came through the high window, and he bent down and picked it up. It was a pocket watch, gold-cased heavy with a chain that had been separated at some point from whatever it had been attached to. He opened the case. On the inside of the front cover, engraved in the formal script of a jeweler, RT 1861, Roscoe Tulliver. Calder held the watch in his palm for a moment. He was 10 years old, but he was Gideon Calloway's son, which meant he had been raised around the habit of thinking before acting, and he thought now. He thought about what a dead man's watch was doing in the grain storage building of Callaway Creek Ranch. He thought about how it had gotten there. He thought about what it would mean to the wrong person if they found it here. He closed his hand around the watch and walked directly to the house. He did not stop in the kitchen. He did not speak to Agnes. He went upstairs, knocked on Verity's door, and waited. She opened it. She looked at his face and then at his closed hand. "I found something," he said. She stepped back and let him in and closed the door. He opened his hand. She looked at the watch for a moment. Then she took it from him carefully by the chain and examined the inscription. She turned it over and examined the case back. She set it on the desk and stood looking at it. She said where exactly he told her. The south corner of the grain storage building, half buried in spilled grain near the base of the south wall. He described the location precisely the way she had taught him to describe anything he was reporting, specific without interpretation, in the order it happened. She looked at the south wall of the grain storage building through the window, as though she could see it from here. The south wall of the grain storage building is directly visible from the small side door that opened between the storage building and the main barn. That side door was latched from the inside, but its latch was simple, a thing that anyone who had been in the building once would know about. It was the kind of latch that a man who arrived at a working ranch in an official capacity, who was shown around the premises while conducting his business, might very easily have observed. Sheriff Bassett and his deputies had visited Callaway Creek Ranch 3 days before Gideon's arrest to take statements. They had been given access to the property. They had walked through the barn complex, and Chet Rafferty had come with them. Verity turned away from the window. She looked at Calder with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life, not because it was dramatic or emotional, but because it was the expression of someone who has just seen the last piece of a structure fall into place and now knows exactly what the structure is. "You have done something important," she said. "I need you to tell no one about this. Not Ward, not Fletcher, not Agnes. Can you hold that?" He nodded. He did not ask why. He trusted the request. "When the time comes, I will need you to tell exactly what you told me." The location, the position, the light conditions. Exactly as you described it. He nodded again. Good, she said. She set the watch in the center of the desk. Go downstairs and have supper. Tell Agnes you looked in the grain storage building and everything was in order. He went. She sat at the desk with the watch in her notebook and the 2 hours of notes from Tulliver's office, and for the first time since the 14th of November, the shape of the thing was complete enough to see. That evening, after Calder was in bed and Agnes had gone to her room, Verity brought Ward and Fletcher into the kitchen and closed the door. She laid her materials on the table in the order she intended to present them. The comparison of the authentic signatures against the forged receipt. The notebook pages from Tulliver's brokerage records transcribed in her own hand, with the original phrasings preserved exactly. The final 3 marginal entries, the watch in the center of the table on the clean cloth. She talked them through it in the same order she had assembled it from the outside, in the way you present any argument that depends on cumulative evidence rather than a single decisive fact. The forged receipt first, the analysis of the signature characteristics, the date notation convention, the implication. Ward listened with the attention of a man who lived in numbers and recognized when numbers were being manipulated. Fletcher listened with the broader attention of someone who had spent years watching the dynamics of people in a small community and understood what the forgery meant in human terms. Then the Tulliver records, the supplementary notebook, the initials CWW and the payments across 2 years and 4 months. The language of rate adjustment and market coordination and what those phrases actually meant in practical terms for every ranch in the valley that had sold cattle through Tulliver's brokerage. The total she had calculated. Ward was quiet for a long time after that. A long time. He was the kind of man who did not speak until he had processed a thing fully, and processing this took what it took. Fletcher said very quietly, Whitmore. The initials fit, Verity said. I cannot yet place his name beside them with certainty, but the payments would serve exactly the purpose someone in his position would have for making them. He controls freight. He needs access through this valley. He needs the ranches here to be financially pressured enough to consider selling. And Edmund found out, Ward said. He was looking at the marginal note that said, must speak with GC. Not Edmund. Tulliver was going to tell Gideon. Yes. And someone who knew that Tulliver was going to tell Gideon arranged to have Tulliver silenced and Gideon implicated in the same action. That is what the evidence suggests. Ward looked at the watch. The watch places the fabricated evidence in our grain storage, which means someone with access to our property put it there, deliberately, so that when a search was conducted, it would be found. A search that would have been conducted by Bassett or his deputies, Fletcher said. The same people who were here 3 days before the arrest and had access to every building on the property. The kitchen was very quiet. Ward picked up the notebook page with the marginal entries and read them again. He set it down. He picked up the comparison of the signatures and held it near the lamp. He set that down too. We need someone with the authority to bring this in front of a court, he said. Someone Bassett cannot dismiss or maneuver around. Someone who is not part of the local office. Judge Cyrus Aldgate, Verity said. He is the Ludong territorial judge for this circuit. He is based in Helena. I heard his name at the county clerk's office when I was obtaining the document copy. The clerk mentioned him in connection with an upcoming territorial court session as someone who operated entirely independently of the local judicial structure. She looked at Ward. Do you know him? Ward looked at Fletcher, a long look, the kind that carried history. Our father knew him, Ward said. They had business dealings in the early years of the ranch. I have corresponded with him twice in matters of contract law. He stood up from the table. I will send the telegram tonight. Harrow's Crossing Station keeps a night operator on through to midnight. Fletcher was already standing. Rafferty Pocheto, he said, I do not think he has left the territory. Men like Rafferty do not leave until they have been paid the second half of what they are owed, and men like Whitmore do not pay the second half until the outcome is secured. He reached for his coat. I have some idea of where to look. Verity looked at both of them. Two Calloway brothers in a kitchen that was too small for the size of what had just been decided, moving with the specific gravity of men who have been waiting for something actionable and have finally found it. Ward stopped at the door and looked back. The watch, he said. Keep it where Bassett cannot reach it. I know, Verity said. He went. She sat alone at the kitchen table for a moment with the lamp and the notebook and Tulliver's marginal entries, in Gideon Calloway's authentic signatures, in the gold watch that a careful 10-year-old boy had found in a grain storage building and brought straight to her without being asked. And she thought about the specific kind of courage it took to do what was right when you were small enough that the people around you might not think to look. She closed her notebook. She picked up the watch and held it in her closed hand for a moment. Then she went to bed because the next day was going to require everything she had. Judge Cyrus Allgate arrived in Harrow's Crossing on the afternoon of the 24th of November, 4 days after Ward's telegram reached the Helena office, which was faster than anyone had reasonably expected, and which said something about the judge's assessment of what the telegram contained. He came by the northbound stage from the rail connection at Billings, and he arrived with a single leather case and the appearance of a man who had been traveling for a long time and considered this a normal condition of his existence. He was 67 years old, spare and upright, with a face that had been refined by decades of listening to people attempt to deceive him into something that resembled a very fine-grained wood, close and hard and difficult to read in poor light. His eyes were a pale gray that had the quality of winter sky before snow, and they moved across everything they encountered with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned long ago that the first look rarely showed you the most important thing. Ward met him at the stage depot. They shook hands in the way of men who have corresponded but not met, taking the measure of the correspondence against the person and finding on both sides that the assessment held. Allgate came out to Callaway Creek Ranch that same evening. He sat at the kitchen table with his leather case open in front of him and read through every document Verity had assembled in the order she had assembled it, without speaking and without rushing. Agnes Yates brought coffee without being asked. Fletcher stood at the window. Ward sat across from the judge and watched him read with the attention of a man reviewing his own work for errors. Calder had been told gently but firmly to stay in his room. He had complied with the specific obedience of a child who understands that compliance is itself a form of participation. The judge read for 40 minutes. Then he closed the last page and folded his hands on the table and looked at Verity, who was sitting at the end of the table where she could see his face clearly. The signature analysis, he said, the linking stroke is absent from the receipt in every instance. Across 4 years of authentic documents, it appears without exception. The date notation, consistent across all authentic documents. Month preceding day, the receipt reverses this. And the Tulliver records, transcribed directly from the supplementary notebook. I can attest to the accuracy of the transcription. Allgate looked at the transcription pages again. He touched the marginal entry that read, "Must speak with GC," with one finger not pointing, simply acknowledging. "The watch," he said. Ward placed it on the table in front of him. Allgate did not pick it up. He examined it from where it sat, the inscription visible, the chain coiled beside it. "The boy found this," he said. "Yes." "How old is the boy at 10? The judge was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The watch was placed there. It was not lost there." "That is my conclusion." "On what basis?" "The location. The grain storage building is used regularly at this time of year. Any item dropped there accidentally would have been found within days by the ranch hands or Agnes Yates during normal operations. The watch was in the south corner near the base of the wall, partially covered by loose grain. That position is consistent with deliberate placement by someone who wanted the item to be findable by a searcher, but not immediately obvious to a casual observer." She paused. "The south corner is directly accessible from the side door between the storage building and the barn. That door was unlatched during the visit by Sheriff Bassett's party on the 11th of November, 3 days before the arrest." Allgate nodded once. He looked at Ward. "I will need a full day to review the county court record on the preliminary matter," he said. "I will also need to speak with the county clerk independently, and I will want to see the brokerage office." "All of that can be arranged," Ward said. "It will be arranged tomorrow." He looked at his case, then at Verity. "Your preparation of this material is thorough. I want that noted." He said it without warmth and without elaboration, as a simple factual statement, which from Cyrus Allgate Ward would later explain was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Thank you," Verity said. "Do not thank me yet. We have work to do before this goes in front of any proceeding." He closed his case and accepted the room Agnes had prepared and went to bed. And the kitchen at Callaway Creek Ranch was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of the past 10 days. It was not the held breath of people waiting for something terrible. It was the quiet of people who have found their footing and are about to move. Conrad Whitmore's first response to the news that a territorial judge had been called in came on the morning of the 26th, and it was precisely what Verity had anticipated. He went to Lavinia Tulliver. He arrived at her house on the north side of Harrow's Crossing with an expression of deep neighborly concern and a proposal that was dressed in the language of protection. He offered her a sum of money described as compensation for the disruption to her husband's business affairs caused by the ongoing investigation, and the sum was generous enough that a woman in her position, frightened and alone and uncertain about her financial future, would have had every practical reason to accept it. The terms of the acceptance were not stated explicitly. They did not need to be. A woman who accepted money from Conrad Whitmore in this context would find it difficult to continue cooperating with any examination of her late husband's business records. Lavinia Tulliver, however, had already been visited by Ward Callaway 3 days earlier, and Ward had explained certain things to her in the plain and careful language he used when something mattered enough to require absolute clarity. He had explained what he believed had happened to her husband and why. And he had explained that the records in that brokerage office were the only evidence that existed of what Tulliver had been trying to do before he died. And he had asked her, not with pressure, but with honesty, whether she wanted to know what her husband had been reaching toward at the end. She had said yes. So when Whitmore came with his money and his gentleness, Lavinia Tulliver told him that the records had already been examined and a report had already been filed with the territorial court, and she thanked him for his concern and closed her door. Whitmore's expression when he turned away from that door was not observed by anyone at the time, but the effects of it were. On the 28th of November, Chet Rafferty disappeared from his lodgings at the boarding house on the east side of Harrow's Crossing. His room was cleared. His horse was gone from the livery. He had paid his week's board the previous evening, which suggested the departure was planned rather than panicked. But the timing coming 4 days after Judge Allgate's arrival became known in town was not coincidental. Allgate received this information at breakfast and recorded it in his case notes with the brief notation, "Witness flight consistent with manufactured testimony." He did not appear surprised. Fletcher, however, had been ahead of this. He had known since the 25th that Rafferty had not left the territory. He had known this because Fletcher Callaway had spent years cultivating the specific skill of knowing where people were and what they were doing, skill that required patience and generosity and the kind of interest in other human beings that was genuinely felt rather than performed, and which people recognized and responded to with a corresponding openness. A man who worked at the grain exchange north of town had mentioned in the course of an entirely unrelated conversation about feed prices that he had seen a man matching Rafferty's description camping at the old Denton, spread an abandoned homestead 7 miles north of Harrow's Crossing that had been empty for 3 years. Fletcher had said nothing about this to anyone except Verity because he wanted to be certain before he moved. On the morning of the 28th, the same morning, Rafferty's absence from his lodgings was noted. Fletcher rode north with 2 of the ranch hands he trusted most. They were gone for 4 hours. When they came back, Rafferty was with them. He was not restrained. He was riding his own horse. He looked like a man who has been doing a calculation for several days and has finally arrived at an answer he does not like but cannot argue with. Fletcher had found him at the Denton spread as expected and had sat down across from him in the cold shell of the abandoned house and spoken to him in the straightforward way Fletcher spoke to everyone without theatrics or threats, simply laying out what was known and what would be presented and what the likely outcome was for a man who had committed perjury in a murder investigation when the evidence showed clearly that the primary accusation was false. Rafferty had not directly participated in Tulliver's death. This was a distinction that mattered, and Fletcher had made it clearly. What Rafferty had done was place fabricated evidence and provide false testimony, which were serious offenses, but different in kind from what had been done to Tulliver. A man who came forward with the truth Fletcher had said was in a materially different position before a territorial judge than a man who was brought in having been found in hiding. Rafferty had ridden back to Harrow's Crossing of his own accord. He met with Judge Allgate that afternoon in the county clerk's office with a territorial deputy present, and he gave a statement. He had been hired 6 weeks earlier through an intermediary to come to the area establish himself briefly as a working man, passing through and perform two specific tasks. The first task had been the placement of the watch in the grain storage building during the visit with Sheriff Bassett's party. The second task had been the testimony regarding Gideon Calloway's movements on the evening of the 11th. He had not been present in the office with Tulliver. He did not know who had been. He had been hired and paid through the intermediary and had not met directly with the person who had engaged the intermediary services. He named the intermediary. Allgate wrote down the name. He looked at it. He looked at Rafferty. "You understand what you have just done," the judge said. Rafferty said that he did. "You will be held in the county office until the proceeding is concluded. You will testify to exactly what you have just told me. If your testimony differs in any material respect from this statement, the question of your own culpability in this matter will be reviewed in its most serious light." Rafferty nodded. Allgate looked at the name he had written down. The name of the intermediary was a man who worked directly for Conrad Whitmore. Whitmore's second response came 2 days before the scheduled hearing. He appeared at the general store when Verity was there, which was not accidental. She had come to purchase a new pen nib and a small bottle of ink. Ordinary items, and she had been in town for no more than 20 minutes when he appeared in the doorway of the store with the expression he had abandoned after Lavinia Tulliver closed her door. The pleasantness was still present, but it was working harder now. Underneath it, something else was visible, the way the frame of a building becomes visible when the exterior is under pressure. He waited until Mrs. Travers moved to the back room to retrieve the ink. "Miss Ashworth," he said. Mrs. Verity said, "She had been correcting this for 6 weeks and she did not intend to stop. You have put a great deal of effort into something that is ultimately a matter between the men involved," he said. He kept his voice low and even, the voice of someone accustomed to saying difficult things in rooms where they could not be overheard. "The Calloway brothers are capable of protecting their own interests. They do not need you to protect those interests for them. You have placed yourself in a complicated position." "I am not aware of any complication in my position," Verity said. "Your situation in this territory is not straightforward. You arrived under an arrangement that no longer has a legal basis. Your continued residence at the Calloway Ranch is a matter of the family's generosity, not of any formal right. A woman in that position who creates enemies among people of standing in the community is making her situation more precarious, not less." Verity looked at him with the attention she applied to numbers that were trying to tell her something important through misdirection. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "but I find I am not particularly moved by it." He looked at her for a moment with those pale eyes that had been calculating everything they landed on since the first time she had seen him in the yard. Then something shifted in his expression, the pleasantness finally giving way entirely to what was underneath it, which was not rage but something colder and more considered. "You are making a mistake," he said. "I make mistakes regularly," Verity said. "I find they are easier to correct than injustices." Mrs. Travers returned from the back room with the ink. Whitmore turned and left without purchasing anything. Mrs. Travers set the ink on the counter and looked at the door through which he had just gone, and then at Verity with the expression of a woman who had heard everything and was filing it away in the comprehensive archive she maintained of everything that happened in her town. "Thank you," Verity said, paying for the ink. "Any time," said Miss Travers, and did not specify what she was thanking Verity for, which did not need specifying. The hearing was held on the 1st of December in the territorial courtroom at Harrow's Crossing, which was a single large room on the second floor of the county building with 2 windows facing north and benches that had been built for utility rather than comfort. Every bench was full. Harrow's Crossing had opinions about Gideon Calloway and Conrad Whitmore and the woman from Boston who had been at the ranch for 6 weeks, and these opinions had been formed through the specific processes by which opinions are formed in small communities, which involve a great deal of observation and conversation, and the comparison of what people say against what people do over time. The result in this instance was that a significant majority of the people on those benches had already reached a conclusion, and they had come to watch the official process confirm what they already knew, or to see the whole thing collapse in a way that would require them to revise their thinking, and either outcome seemed worth a cold morning in a hard-benched room. Gideon Calloway was brought in from the county holding facility and seated at the defendant's table. He had been held for 17 days. He was thinner than he had been, and there was a quality to his stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness, more compressed, the stillness of something under considerable pressure that has not yet found its release point. He sat with his back straight and his hands on the table, and he looked at the room with the unhurried assessment he brought to everything. He looked at Ward and Fletcher in the gallery. He looked at Agnes Yates, who had come in her good coat, and her expression of someone who considers the truth a practical matter that courts exist to locate and confirm. He looked at Calder, seated between Fletcher and Agnes, wearing his father's old vest coat that was 3 sizes too large, in a gravity that made him look briefly like the man he was going to be in 20 years. Then he looked at Verity, seated at the front table beside Judge Allgate, and he looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, he communicated something that required no translation. It was not a look of hope or of instruction. It was a look of placement. The same look he had given her from the ward on the 14th of November, but resolved, now settled. He had put his trust somewhere specific, and he knew where it was, and he was not worried about it. Verity looked back. She nodded once. Then she turned to face forward because there was work to do. Allgate opened the proceedings with the economy of a man who had conducted enough of them to know that ceremony without substance was a waste of the court's time and everyone else's. He stated the matter before the court. He stated the basis on which the preliminary charge against Gideon Calloway was being challenged. He stated that the court would hear evidence regarding the authenticity of the documents submitted in support of the charge and the reliability of the witness testimony on which the charge rested. Whitmore had retained a lawyer from Helena named Delaney, a man of perhaps 55 who had the air of someone who had argued in front of many courts and considered himself adept at reading which direction they were leaning and adjusting accordingly. He sat at the opposing table with his papers ordered and his expression composed and his assessment of Verity, which he was not trying to conceal, indicating that he had decided how to proceed with the question of her testimony before the session had begun. Allgate called Verity first. She came to the front of the room and stood where directed and answered the preliminary questions about her identity and her presence in Harrow's Crossing and her relationship to the Calloway household with the same plain directness she brought to everything. She stated her name. She stated her age. She stated that she had come to Harrow's Crossing as the intended wife of Edmund Calloway, that Edmund had predeceased her arrival, and that she had subsequently been employed by the Calloway family in the capacity of household accountant and governess. Delaney observed all of this with a patience that was preparatory. Allgate then asked her to present her analysis of the disputed receipt. She presented it in the order she had assembled it. She placed the receipt beside the authenticated documents from the ranch files, and she walked the court through the signature characteristics, the linking, stroke, the date notation, convention, the accumulated pattern of a man writing his own name across 4 years of ordinary ranch business versus the single instance of the receipt. She was precise and she was not hurried, because hurrying through evidence was a way of asking the listener to trust you rather than asking them to see what you were seeing, and she wanted the room to see. She presented the expert comparison that Ward had obtained from Helena, a document examiner, who had provided a written assessment confirming the signature discrepancies with specific technical notation. She presented her transcription of Tulliver's supplementary records, explained what they contained and what the entries meant in the context of regional cattle commerce, and read the final 3 marginal entries in their original language, in the order they had been written, ending with, "must speak with GC." The room was quiet in a way that had more weight to it than noise. Delaney rose when Allgate indicated he could examine. He was careful. He was not hostile in any obvious way, because he had enough experience to know that obvious hostility toward a witness who had just delivered an hour of clear and organized evidence would not serve his client. He questioned the basis of her expertise. He noted that she was not a licensed document examiner. He noted that she was not an accountant of formal certification. He noted that her assessment of Tulliver's records had been made in a private capacity without official sanction. Verity answered each point in the same tone she had used throughout. She was not a licensed document examiner. The comparison she had made did not require a license to see. She invited anyone present to look at the 2 documents side by side and observe the stroke she had described. The observation did not require expertise to make. It required only attention. She was not a formally certified accountant. Her father had been a banker who had trained her in accounting practice from the age of 8. She had managed accounts professionally for 6 years. The entries in Tulliver's supplementary notebook used standard commercial notation that any person with bookkeeping experience would recognize. She invited the court to examine the entries directly. Delaney shifted. He moved to the question of her presence in the household and her relationship to the family, and he characterized her position with a precision that was designed to suggest that her analysis was motivated by personal interest rather than factual observation. "You have lived in the Calloway home for 6 weeks," he said. "I have. You have a personal and professional relationship with the family that would be significantly affected by the outcome of this proceeding. That is accurate. So the court should understand that your analysis was conducted not by a neutral party, but by someone with a direct interest in a specific outcome." Verity looked at him with the attention she gave to ledger entries that appeared to say one thing while meaning another. "The court should understand," she said, "that no analysis is conducted by a person with no relationship to the subject. The question is whether the analysis is accurate. Whether the signature stroke is present or absent does not change based on who is looking at it. Whether the date notation follows the Western Convention or the Eastern Convention does not change based on who is reading it. Whether Roscoe Tulliver wrote 'must speak with GC' in his own hand in the margin of his private record does not change based on who transcribed it." She paused. "If counsel has evidence that my transcription is inaccurate or that my observation of the signatures is incorrect, I would be interested to hear it. If he does not, then the question of my relationship to the family is beside the point." Delaney looked at her for a moment. He did not have evidence that her transcription was inaccurate or that her observation of the signatures was incorrect. He moved to a different question. Calder Calloway was called as a witness in the matter of the watch. He walked to the front of the room with his father's vest coat hanging from his shoulders and his face arranged in the expression of someone performing an important task to the best of his ability. He was 10 years old and the room was full of adults, and he stood in front of all of them and described what he had found and where he had found it in exactly the language Verity had taught him, specific without interpretation, in the order it happened. He described the south corner of the grain storage building. He described the position of the watch in the loose grain near the base of the south wall. He described the light conditions and the way the metal had caught it. He described the inscription on the inside of the case. He described the side door between the storage building and the barn. He described the latch. He said because it was accurate and because Verity had told him to say what was accurate without addition or embellishment, that Sheriff Bassett's party had been in the barn complex on the 11th of November during the visit to take statements, and that the side door had been unlatched at that time, as it normally was during working hours. He was not asked to draw any conclusions from these facts. He simply stated the facts. The conclusions were available to everyone in the room who was paying attention, which was everyone in the room. Aldgate thanked him and directed him back to his seat. Fletcher then provided the court with a written statement from Rafferty, which had been given under oath in the county clerk's office 3 days prior and attested by the territorial deputy who had been present. The statement described Rafferty's engagement in the 2 tasks he had been paid to perform. It named the intermediary through whom he had been hired. Aldgate read the statement into the record. The name of the intermediary sat in the air of the courtroom for a moment, in the way that certain names sit in certain rooms, heavy with implication. Delaney requested a recess. Aldgate granted 30 minutes. During those 30 minutes, Verity sat at the front table and looked at her notebook without reading it. Fletcher came and sat beside her briefly and said nothing, which was the right thing. Agnes Yates passed behind them on her way to the window and pressed Verity's shoulder once with one hand, the firm, brief contact of a woman who does not distribute such gestures carelessly. When the court resumed, Delaney made a final argument that was technically competent and visibly depleted the argument of a man who has looked at what he has to work with and found it insufficient, but has an obligation to use it regardless. He questioned the chain of custody of the watch. He questioned the reliability of a witness who had negotiated his own position before testifying. He returned briefly to the question of Verity's neutrality, found it no more productive than the first time, and concluded. Aldgate listened with an expression that gave nothing away and had given nothing away for the entire morning. He called a 45-minute recess for consideration. The 45 minutes passed the way such intervals pass, which is to say slowly on the surface and very quickly inside. People spoke to each other in the low voices of those who are waiting for something already decided to become official. Agnes Yates stood at the window. Ward stood near the door with his arms at his sides and his face composed into the neutral expression he wore when he was processing something large. Fletcher stayed beside Calder and talked to him quietly about nothing consequential, which was a gift of the specific kind only Fletcher could give. Verity sat at the front table with her hands folded and her breathing even, and her mind very still. The stillness that came not from the absence of thought, but from having thought everything there was to think and arrived at the end of it. Gideon Calloway across the room had not moved from his posture since the session began. He sat with the compressed stillness she had come to understand was not indifference, but its opposite, the full engagement of a person who has learned to contain rather than display. Once during the recess, she looked at him. He was already looking at her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that was not already understood. Aldgate returned at the 45-minute mark exactly. He sat, he arranged his papers, he removed his spectacles and cleaned them and replaced them, which appeared to be a habitual sequence that had nothing to do with his vision and everything to do with a private act of preparation. Then he spoke. He said that he had reviewed the evidence presented in its entirety. He said that the analysis of the disputed receipt indicated with sufficient certainty that the document had not been signed by Gideon Calloway, based on the testimony of both Verity Ashworth and the document examiner from Helena, whose technical assessment corroborated the observational analysis. He said that the evidence from Tulliver's supplementary records combined with Rafferty's sworn statement and the physical evidence of the watch and its placement indicated a coordinated effort to manufacture grounds for the detention of Gideon Calloway and to suppress testimony that bore directly on commercial practices harmful to the ranching community of this valley region. He said the charge against Gideon Calloway was dismissed. He said Gideon Calloway was to be released immediately. He said that the matter of the intermediary named in Rafferty's statement and the connection of that intermediary to a principal whose identity the court would be investigating through the appropriate territorial channels was hereby referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for formal examination. He said this examination would include the question of who had benefited from the suppressed pricing scheme documented in Tulliver's records, and the question of who had arranged and financed the actions that had resulted in Tulliver's death and Calloway's wrongful detention. He said Sheriff Orrin Bassett was suspended from his duties pending a review of his handling of the preliminary matter to be conducted by the Territorial Marshal's Office. He set down his papers. The room did not erupt. It released the way a room releases when something held for a long time is finally set down a collective exhale that was neither celebration nor relief exactly, but some combination of the two that has no specific name. Gideon Calloway walked out of the county building into the December light, and Calder was already moving before the door had fully opened, crossing the wooden sidewalk at a run, and Gideon caught him and held him with both arms and bent his head down over the boys, and stayed that way for a moment that belonged to no one else. Ward stood on the sidewalk with his arms at his sides. Fletcher stood beside him. Agnes Yates produced a handkerchief from her coat pocket and applied it to her face with the determined efficiency of a woman who has decided that this particular moment qualifies. Verity stood slightly apart from all of it. She did not move toward them. This was theirs first, and she understood that, and she was content to stand at the edge of it and let it be what it was. Then Gideon lifted his head. He looked across the sidewalk and found her through the people between them, the way a person finds the thing they are looking for when they know exactly what they are looking for directly and without searching. He said her name, just that. One word, her name, in his voice, which was low and rough from 17 days of using it less than usual, and it carried across the December air between them with the weight of everything it was standing in for. She walked toward him. She did not plan what she was going to say. There was nothing to plan. She simply crossed the distance and stood in front of him, and he looked at her with the full unguarded attention that she had been given only in pieces before this, the complete version of it, and she looked back at him the same way, and neither of them spoke for a moment because the moment did not require it. Ward cleared his throat. Fletcher made a sound that might have been laughter briefly. Thank you, Gideon said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly and without decoration and with the full weight of what he meant behind it. It was the right thing to Verity said. Yes, he said, it was. He did not say anything else then, but his hand came up and rested briefly on her shoulder, the same gesture Agnes had used, but different in kind, and she stood with the weight of it for a moment before it was gone, and they were all moving toward the horses. 4 days later, on the evening of the 3rd of December, after Calder was in bed, and Agnes had gone to her room and Ward and Fletcher had retired to the far sitting room with the deliberate tact of men who have decided to be elsewhere, Gideon Calloway came into the kitchen and sat down across from Verity at the table where she was reviewing the month's household accounts. She set down her pen. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at her. He was the kind of man for whom this kind of conversation was not natural, not because he lacked the capacity for it, but because the language of it was foreign to him in the way that a second language is foreign understood, but requiring effort to speak. He made the effort. When I was in that cell, he said, I thought about a number of things. The ranch, Calder, Ward and Fletcher. He paused. What I thought about most was what you were doing out here. Not because I was certain you would find something, but because it was the first time in a long time that I believed there was someone outside this family who was standing in the same direction as us. He looked at his hands. I did not know what to do with that belief. It was unfamiliar. Verity said nothing. She was listening with all of herself. Rowena was the person I trusted completely, he said. When she died, I thought that was the end of that. Not that I would not continue. I would continue because the ranch required it and Calder required it. But that particular thing, the belief that someone else was standing with you rather than around you or beside you, I thought that was finished. He looked up. I was wrong about that. The kitchen was very quiet. The wind outside moved against the north window, and the stove settled in the particular way of metal cooling, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted, and all of it was the sound of the place itself, the ordinary sound of Calloway Creek Ranch at night. You came here with $11 in the name of a man who was already gone, he said. You did not ask for anything that was not reasonable. You found things that had been lost and things that had been hidden, and one thing that a 10-year-old boy found in a grain storage building because he had been taught to pay attention and to bring what he found to the right person. He paused. You stood in that room today in front of everyone in this county and said the true thing clearly and without flinching. He was quiet for a moment. Marry me, Verity. Not because you need the situation and not because I owe you anything, though the accounting on that second point would not go in my favor. Marry me because when you are in this house, it is a home in the way it has not been in 14 months. And when I think about the years ahead of this one, I want to think about them with you in them. He did not move toward her. He did not reach across the table. He simply looked at her with those gray eyes that were his son's eyes with the full and undefended weight of what he was saying behind them. Verity sat with it for a moment, not because she was uncertain, because it deserved to be received properly, not hastily, not as a thing grabbed at out of relief or circumstance. I have known what my answer would be, she said. Since the morning I came downstairs and found a cup of coffee already poured with exactly the right amount of cream on the table where I sit. She looked at him steadily. You noticed something small and you acted on it without being asked and without expecting acknowledgement. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of person someone can build a life with. She paused. Yes, Gideon Calloway. That is my answer. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face resolve settled the way a landscape settles after weather has passed through and the light comes back. Good, he said. From the far sitting room in the specific silence of two men who had been listening to every word and had just received the information they had been waiting for, there was a sound that might have been Ward exhaling and might have been Fletcher's suppressing an expression of some kind, and then the sound of both of them moving, and Ward appeared in the doorway first with his expression composed and his eyes doing something they rarely did. He looked at his brother. He looked at Verity. She manages the accounts better than I do, he said. Fletcher appeared behind him. Ward, that is the most romantic thing you have ever said. It is a factual statement. That is what makes it romantic. Verity laughed. It came up from somewhere genuine and unguarded, the laugh of someone who has been holding a great many things carefully for a long time and has been given permission to set them down. Gideon across the table watched her with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he needed to confirm. Ward stepped forward and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was brief and firm, and said everything he did not intend to say aloud, which was considerable. Fletcher came past him and embraced her with the uncomplicated warmth that was entirely his own, the embrace of a man for whom affection is not complicated, and said into her hair, "Welcome to the family. We are difficult and we are worth it." "I had already concluded as much," Verity said. "Good." He stepped back, grinning. "Now someone should probably tell Calder before he finds out from Agnes." Calder found out from Gideon. He came downstairs the next morning at 7 o'clock with his hair uncombed and his eyes sharp from sleep, assessed the atmosphere into the kitchen with the accuracy of a child who has been reading rooms his whole life, and looked at his father. Gideon crouched down to his level, the way he always did when something needed to be said honestly. He said it honestly. Calder considered this information in the silence of someone processing something significant. He looked at Verity, he looked at his father, he looked at his hands. "I still have to do the arithmetic," he said. "You do," Verity said. "And the grammar." "And the grammar." He thought about this for another moment. "All right," he said, very quietly to the table, to no one in particular, "I am glad." He sat down and reached for the bread and ate his breakfast in the ordinary way of a boy who has closed a chapter and opened another and intends to get on with it, and the corner of his mouth was doing something that he was not trying to control. They were married on the 22nd of December in the Harrows Crossing Church, which was small and cold and full to the walls with people who had not been formally invited and had come regardless. Agnes Yates had sewn the dress in the week and a half between the proposal and the ceremony, working in the evenings after the household was settled, with a speed and precision that suggested she had been waiting for the occasion and had her own ideas about how it should look. It was deep blue, the color of the Montana sky on a clear winter morning, with white lace at the collar and cuffs that came from Agnes's own cedar chest, from a length she had kept for 40 years and had not found a use for until now. Verity pinned her mother's brooch at her collar. She looked at herself in the small, foxed mirror above the washstand and thought they would have liked this, her parents. She thought it not with grief, but with the particular tenderness of someone who has made peace with what is gone and can hold the memory of it without being pulled under. The church was bright with winter light and the smell of pine boughs that the congregation had brought to line the windows, and the benches held every person who had an opinion about what had happened in this valley in the past 6 weeks, which meant everyone who lived within riding distance. Mrs. Travers was in the third row. The ranch hands came in their best shirts. 3 of their wives had arranged dried flowers along the aisle flowers that had been preserved from the summer and carried in through the December cold and set in their places with a care that made them more beautiful than fresh ones might have been. Ward stood beside Gideon. Fletcher stood beside Ward with an expression that had given up entirely on composure and was not apologizing for it. Agnes Yates was in the front row with Calder, and Calder was wearing Gideon's old vest coat, the one that was 3 sizes too large, with the gravity and purpose of someone entrusted with an important task, which he was. When the minister asked if anyone present had cause to object, Mrs. Travers said from the third row, and without embarrassment, "Finally." The church laughed. All of it at once, the warm, unanimous laughter of people who have been waiting for something right to happen and are pleased to see it arrive. Gideon Calloway smiled, the real kind, the kind that came from the place his smiles had come from, before grief had narrowed the access to them, full and unguarded and completely honest, and Verity, standing across from him, thought, there it is. There is the man underneath everything he has been carrying. And she thought, I'm going to spend a long time making sure that man has reasons to appear. The minister concluded the ceremony. When they were pronounced married, the church applauded in the way of people who have been cold and uncomfortable on hard benches for an hour and consider the outcome entirely worth it. On the morning of the 23rd of December, Verity came downstairs before anyone else was moving and found Calder's journal on the kitchen table. He had begun keeping the journal in the 3rd week of October at her suggestion, originally as a record of his memories of Rowena, a container for things he was afraid of losing if he did not write them down. It had evolved in the way of journals kept by people who are actually paying attention to their lives into something larger. She had not read it. She had never asked to read it. She had simply made it available and trusted him to use it. It was on the table open, and this was deliberate. She understood that immediately. He had left it there for her. She sat down and read the last entry. It was dated December 23rd, 1878. The handwriting was neater than it had been in October. He had been practicing. Pa got married yesterday. I was the one standing next to him. I held the ring the whole time and did not drop it. Verity is not Mama, and she will never be Mama. I know that. But Mama used to say that love was not a thing with a limit on it, that a person could love two children exactly the same amount without one taking from the other. And I think she meant it to work in other directions too. Pa smiled at the church. The real kind. I have not seen the real kind since before Mama died. I did not know how much I missed seeing it until it was there again. Uncle Ward shook Verity's hand when Pa told us. Uncle Fletcher hugged her and tried not to cry. He did not succeed, but he says he did, and we are all letting him say that. I think this is what a family is. Not the same shape as before. Different, but nothing missing. Geometry is still difficult. Verity says I have not found the right way to look at it yet. She is usually right about things like that, Meta Calloway. Verity sat with the journal for a moment, her hand resting on the open page. Then she heard the sound of boots on the stairs, the particular weight and pace of them, and she did not need to look up to know who it was. Gideon came into the kitchen with the cold of the early morning still on his coat, and he stopped when he saw her at the table with the open journal. He crossed the room. He looked over her shoulder at the page. She heard his breath change just slightly. Just a small shift of someone receiving something they were not entirely prepared for. He sat down beside her. He reached for the coffee pot and poured 2 cups hers with the cream his without and set them on the table, and they sat together in the kitchen while the winter light came in through the east window and the ranch woke up around them, the sounds of it moving through the walls and floors like something breathing. Calder came down the stairs at his ordinary hour, loud and purposeful, already talking before he reached the bottom. Geometry today, Verity said. I have been thinking about it. I still do not understand why the angles have to add up to a specific number. Because the world is consistent, Verity said, even when it does not seem to be. Calder considered this with the expression of someone who is not entirely satisfied, but recognizes a reasonable answer when he hears one. He sat down at the table. He pulled the arithmetic workbook toward him. He opened it to the page where they had left off. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against the windows of Callaway Creek Ranch, with all the cold and weight of a season that had no interest in whether you were ready for it. The peaks to the north were white against the pale sky, and the valley below them was white, and the fence lines cut through the white in dark parallel lines that marked what was held and what was known and what would continue to be, both through every season that came after this one. Inside, there was the sound of a fire in the stove and coffee on the table, and a boy doing his geometry with the resigned diligence of someone who has decided that the people asking him to do it are worth the effort of doing it, and 2 people sitting in the easy silence of those who have found the right place for a thing and set it down there and do not need to discuss it further. There was nothing missing. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.